I'll never forget that night. The call came in, just like any other, but the address was off. Way off. It felt like something was wrong from the moment I pulled into that street. The house stood at the end, dark and abandoned looking, like it hadn't been touched in years. But when I knocked, when I heard that voice from inside, it still gives me chills. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw him. A man, bloodied and staring straight at me. The pizza wasn't the only thing on that porch that night. It was something far worse. It started out like any other shift at the pizzeria. Just another typical Friday night. Deliveries were flying in, pizzas were stacking up, and the team was buzzing around, getting orders out. I'd been working at the local pizzeria for a few months, so the routine was nothing new. But then came the call that would change everything. The order came through at 10:45 p.m. A large pepperoni, extra cheese. Simple enough. The address. I still remember it now. It was for an old house on a street I hadn't driven down before, but the name on the order seemed familiar. 1315 Birchwood Avenue. I grabbed the pizza, double-checked the receipt, and went out to my car. The night was eerily quiet, just the hum of the engine as I drove through the winding streets of the neighborhood. Something felt off the moment I turned onto Birchwood. The road was desolate, empty. It was like a ghost town. I pulled up to the house. At least, that's what I thought it was. The house looked completely abandoned. The windows were dark, the lawn overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the door was peeling away like it hadn't been touched in years. But the order was legit, and I had a job to do. My stomach twisted in a way I couldn't explain, but I shrugged it off. People lived in weird places all the time. Maybe this was just a rundown neighborhood. I rang the doorbell and waited. Nothing. I rang it again, and after what felt like an eternity, I knocked. Still, no answer. I checked the time. 10:55 p.m. The call had been specific, and it was paid for. I couldn't just leave the pizza there, could I? That's when I heard it. A voice muffled through the door, as if it came from behind thick glass. "I'm here. Leave it on the porch." I froze. It was a man's voice, low and raspy, like he was struggling to speak. But there was something about it, something wrong. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts screamed at me to just leave, but I couldn't ignore the job. I set the pizza down on the porch, just like I was told. As I stepped back to turn away, I heard the creak of the door. I glanced over my shoulder. The door was opening slowly. "It's not my pizza." I whipped around. There, standing in the doorway, was a man. At first, I thought he was another customer. Maybe someone just looking for their order. But then I saw his face, pale, gaunt, and drenched in sweat. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't holding the pizza. No, he wasn't even looking at it. His gaze was fixed on me. Before I could say anything, he opened his mouth again, but the words were slurred. "Get off my porch. This isn't your delivery." That's when I saw it. Blood. Fresh blood dripping from his shirt. A stain spreading out from underneath the fabric, soaking the front of his pants. My heart started to race. I was frozen in place, my mind racing with 100 questions. What had happened here? Was this a joke? Was this some kind of sick prank? I stepped backward, my fingers fumbling for my phone in my pocket. The man didn't move. His eyes never left me. Then he muttered something else. His voice was softer now, almost pleading. "It's not safe. You need to leave." That's when my instincts took over. I didn't stop to ask questions. I turned on my heel and bolted back to my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, as if I'd just escaped from something. I don't know. Dangerous. As I drove away, my mind was racing. What the hell had just happened? What was going on at that house? I felt a sickening unease settling in my stomach, a sensation I couldn't shake, no matter how fast I drove. It wasn't until I was back at the pizzeria, trying to shake the feeling of dread, that I learned the truth. That house had been abandoned for over a year. No one had lived there, and the police had reported a brutal murder in that very house 2 weeks prior. The man I had seen, he had been a suspect, but no one had found him. Not until that night. I couldn't shake the memory. That face, blood-soaked and staring at me. And why hadn't I recognized the house? Was it some kind of setup? I needed to know more. When I got back home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I Googled the address, and that's when I saw the reports. 2 weeks earlier, police had found a body in that house, hacked apart and hidden under the floorboards. The most disturbing part, the killer had never been caught. My stomach dropped. I had delivered pizza to a house where a murderer had been hiding. Or worse, maybe the man who answered the door hadn't been the killer at all. Maybe he had been a victim, trapped there, left to die. The next few days were filled with unsettling encounters. I began hearing rumors about other delivery drivers who had seen strange things around Birchwood Avenue. Some had reported deliveries to homes that didn't exist. Others claimed to have encountered shadowy figures moving behind windows. But what terrified me most wasn't what I had seen on the porch. It was the fact that I hadn't been the first to deliver there. The others hadn't come back. It was supposed to be a normal night, just another pizza delivery. But when I knocked on the door, I didn't expect to find a bloody trail leading into the darkness. I didn't expect to come face to face with a man who had been hiding in plain sight, using pizza deliveries to lure his victims. But that night, I learned something terrifying. Some customers don't just want their pizza hot, they want you dead. And I was about to become the next victim of the Pizza Man killer. I had been delivering pizzas for a few months, working late shifts to pay my rent. Most nights, it was uneventful. Just a simple drop-off, a few quick exchanges of cash, and back to the pizzeria. But there's always one night that changes everything. It was around midnight when I got the call. A large pepperoni, extra cheese, and a side of garlic bread. I didn't think anything of it. The address was in a nice suburban neighborhood I'd been to a dozen times before. 2214 Maple Drive. Nothing unusual. The car radio was static as I pulled into the driveway of the house. Something was wrong the moment I stepped out of the car. The lights inside the house were off, and the porch light flickered sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. It wasn't uncommon for people to have their lights off at night, but something about this house, it felt abandoned. Still, I had a job to do. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I knocked. Nothing. "Hello? Pizza," I called out, trying to stay professional. But inside, a knot of unease twisted in my stomach. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, the door creaked open. A man stood there. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, with dark hair that looked like it hadn't been cut in weeks. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. I ordered a pizza, he said in a raspy voice, his breath coming in uneven gasps. I glanced down at the receipt in my hand. His name matched the order, William Bill Knox. That's me, I said, trying to stay calm. I handed him the pizza, but something about his expression made me hesitate. I had delivered to a lot of strange houses, but this one was different. It wasn't just the way he looked. It was the silence around the house. There was no sound, no other movement inside, just the eerie quiet of the night. "Are you okay, man?" I asked, my voice a little shakier than I wanted. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the pizza in my hands, as if he were trying to focus, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the box. Finally, he muttered, "Come inside. I need to tell you something." I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long shift, or maybe something more sinister was pulling me in. But I stepped inside. The air inside the house was thick, stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with garbage, old magazines, dirty plates, and a strange, acrid smell that made my stomach turn. "What do you need to tell me?" I asked, trying to stay casual. Bill led me to the living room, where the lights were dim. The only illumination came from a single lamp in the corner. As he walked ahead, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A blood stain. It was small at first, just a few drops on the carpet near the doorway. But as I looked closer, I saw that the trail led toward a dark hallway at the back of the house. I turned to Bill, but he was already walking down the hallway. "Come on," he urged. "I want to show you something." I didn't move. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like lead. "Look, I should go," I stammered, but before I could turn, he spun around and locked the door. My pulse spiked. "You're not going anywhere yet," he said, his voice suddenly harsh and low, like something was snapping inside him. "You're the one who's going to help me." At that moment, everything clicked. The bloodstains, his erratic behavior, the strange, forced calm in his voice. I wasn't here to drop off a pizza. I was here to be his next victim. Suddenly, I heard a sound. Footsteps, heavy and dragging, from the dark hallway behind him. Bill froze, and his eyes went wide. "You've been here before, haven't you?" I whispered, fear creeping into my voice. His face twisted into something that wasn't quite human. "I knew you'd figure it out. You're not the first," he muttered, almost to himself. My eyes widened. Before I could respond, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. A woman, covered in blood, her hands tied behind her back, her face pale and twisted with fear. "No!" I gasped, backing away toward the door. But before I could make a move, Bill lunged at me, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. I fought him off, but his grip was like iron. "You're mine now," he hissed, a manic grin spreading across his face. In that moment, I knew I was about to be another victim of the pizza man killer. I couldn't think. My mind was spinning as I struggled against Bill's hold. The woman in the hallway was still there, her wide eyes pleading with me, but I knew I had to get out. There was no time to save her. Not yet. With every ounce of strength, I yanked my arm free, stumbling backward toward the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grab the knob, but somehow I managed to wrench it open. Bill let out a low growl, but I didn't look back. I ran fast as I could, not stopping to catch my breath. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life, and I sped away, not daring to glance back at the house. I didn't call the police immediately. The terror was still fresh, and I couldn't bring myself to explain it to anyone. Who would believe me? But when I got home, I found a note in my pocket. A note from Bill. It was simple, yet chilling. It was just another pizza delivery, or so I thought. When I showed up to the house on the edge of town, something felt off. The man who answered the door seemed normal at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. Little did I know, that night, I'd deliver more than just pizza. I was about to come face to face with a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight. What happened next will haunt me forever. It was a Saturday night, just like any other. I was working the late shift at the local pizzeria, a small joint in a quiet town. I didn't expect anything unusual, just the usual rounds of pizza deliveries. It was a steady gig, nothing to complain about. But when the phone rang at 11:30 p.m., it was the beginning of something I could never have imagined. The order was simple: 2 large pizzas, pepperoni and extra cheese, and a side of wings. Nothing strange there. But when I looked at the address, a chill ran through me. 1237 Maplewood Drive. I didn't recognize the street, but I'd been working at the pizzeria for a while, so it wasn't that surprising. I checked the receipt again. Henry Lyle. A name I couldn't place. I grabbed the pizzas and left. The further I drove into the outskirts of town, the more isolated the area became. The houses were spread far apart, each one tucked behind overgrown trees and bushes, making the place feel like a ghost town. When I reached Maplewood Drive, I slowed down. The house at the end of the street was old, run down, and dark. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the yard, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. I parked in the driveway, heart hammering in my chest for no real reason. But something about the place felt off. I shook it off, grabbed the pizzas, and walked up to the front door. I knocked. Nothing. I rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door creaked open. A man stood there, a little too tall, a little too pale. His eyes were a pale blue, almost too wide, and his face had that hollow, gaunt look that comes from long periods of isolation. He looked me over for a moment before speaking. "You're here for the pizza?" he asked, his voice gravelly and soft, like he hadn't spoken in days. I nodded, trying to keep it together. "Yes, sir. 2 large pepperoni, extra cheese, and wings." He stepped aside, allowing me to enter. The air inside the house was thick, stale, and smelled of something unfamiliar, something metallic, like rust. I could hear faint noises coming from the back of the house, scraping sounds, like furniture being dragged across the floor. Before I could question it, the man, Henry, reached into his pocket and handed me the money. I took it, but something about his hand, it was too steady, too deliberate, like he had done this before. He didn't say anything else as I turned to leave, but as I stepped toward the door, he spoke again. "You should be careful out here." The words sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out, eager to leave that house behind. As I was getting into my car, I heard the door behind me close, a soft click, followed by the distant sound of a lock turning. I shrugged it off, just another creepy guy in a quiet town. The next morning, I was still rattled from the weird vibe of that house. The smell, the eerie sounds in the background, and the man's strange warning kept me up most of the night. But it wasn't until I arrived at work that things started to make sense. One of my co-workers, a guy named Dan, was reading a local newspaper when I walked in. He looked up at me, his face pale. "Hey, did you hear about that guy out on Maplewood Drive?" he asked, his voice shaking. I shook my head. "What about him?" Dan pointed to an article on the front page. "Henry Lyle. They just arrested him. He's the one who's been killing people in town." My stomach dropped. It turned out that Henry Lyle, the man I'd just delivered to, was a suspected serial killer. He had been living on the outskirts of town for years, under the radar. No one knew he was there. He was the kind of person you'd forget about in a crowd, blending in seamlessly with the quiet neighborhoods. But the police had finally connected him to a string of disappearances in the area over the past several months. 6 people had gone missing, and all signs pointed to Lyle as the killer. I felt like the world had just spun on its axis. I had walked into the lair of a killer, and when I thought back to that night, the way he looked at me, his odd behavior, the warning, I realized he had known exactly who I was. He had been waiting for me. My hands were shaking as I read the article, the horrifying realization setting in. I had delivered to a serial killer. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if I hadn't left? What if I had walked into that back room where the scraping noises were coming from? What if he had tried to kill me too? It wasn't until the police started asking questions that I learned the full extent of what had been happening in that house. They had found human remains hidden in the basement, along with photographs of Lyle's past victims. Some of them were eerily familiar. People I had seen walking around town. People I had bumped into at the local bar or store. The scariest part, I was lucky. Lyle had been watching me for days. He knew when I'd be making deliveries, and he had chosen me as his next victim. But something, maybe the fact that I was just doing my job, had stopped him. I couldn't get the images out of my head. The house, the strange man, the unsettling warning, and the fact that, in some twisted way, I was the one who had narrowly escaped becoming part of his gruesome collection.